Hello and welcome to F360, Indiana Folklore and Folk Life. In this lecture, I introduce the discipline of folklore, talk about the historical roots of the field, and how folklorists in the United States have changed their scholarly focus by shifting the definition of who are the folk. We'll also explore briefly the concept of folk groups, which provide a useful vantage point for understanding diversity in the U.S. and right here in Indiana. So let's start with a little history. William Toms, an English antiquarian, is usually credited with coining the word folklore, which he described in 1846 as a good Saxon compound. However, the subject of inquiry he hoped to marshal under this seemingly new term had already gained scholarly interest throughout much of Europe. In Germany, it was called Volkskunde, which included the study of stories, crafts, music, beliefs, foods, and other cultural practices of the folk. However, who were these folk? In Germany, like the rest of Europe, the folk, or Volks, were the peasants, rural country folk, who were thought to continue the traditional ways of the culture. They were thought to hold the cultural heritage of the nation-state. The best example of this is in the work of the brothers Grimm, Jakob and Wilhelm, who collected stories for their book Kinder- und Hausmärchen, which we know better as Grimm's Fairy Tales. Their work was fueled by nationalism. The German nation-state was just emerging, and folklore provided a way to identify unifying factors across this confederation of provinces. In addition, there was a general concern over the perceived loss of traditional knowledge due to the industrialization and urbanization that was happening at this time. People were leaving the countryside to find work in cities. Literacy increased, and scholars worried that the oral traditions would vanish. The Grimms encouraged scholars to seek out, organize, and publish folklore. American ballad scholar Francis James Child was greatly influenced by their scholarship and even heard one of their lectures once. In 1888, Child would go on to be the founding president of the American Folklore Society, a professional society aimed to support the collection and research of folklore. In its inaugural journal, it gave its scope of study as being for the collection of the fast-vanishing remains of folklore in America, namely, A. Relics of Old English folklore, ballads, tales, superstitions, dialects, etc. B. Lore of Negroes in the southern states of the Union. C. Lore of Indian tribes of North America, myths, tales, etc. D. Lore of French Canada, Mexico, etc. In this list, the Society's mission expressed two notions about the material to be collected. First, that it was fast vanishing, it was going to be lost. Second, that it was held in the minds of distinct groups of people. Since the U.S. didn't have a peasant class, as was perceived to have been in Europe, we often looked to the poor, rural, ethnic, or other different understanding of people from modern American society. As you can imagine, this understanding of folklore would prove untenable by contemporary scholars. At times, folklore provided an easy way to harbor racist perspectives about groups of people. Nevertheless, scholars witnessed the power of collecting and studying the everyday expressive practices of people, and the insights it gave us about the complexities and diversity of human life. But the notion that only a few people were the folk needed to change, because it was either intentionally or unintentionally classist and racist. Influenced by Darwin's theories that were popular in the 19th century, anthropologists and folklorists ascribed to the notion of cultural evolution, believing some societies were less evolved than Western society. Franz Boas pushed back against this notion. He was a cultural relativist, a group of scholars who argued that the evolutionary view of scholars such as E.B. Tylor were ethnocentric, and it was wrong to view the cultural practices of another group as inferior. Instead, they noted that yes, human cultures have evolved, but they evolved in equal but different ways. This is how the more anthropological folklorists went about their work. However, many folklorists were less interested in the people and more interested in the stuff, the text, searching for the origins and distributions of stories, songs, and cultural practices, which required them to separate the text from their original context. Nevertheless, the conflict over the baggage that the term folk held persisted. So in 1965, folklorist Alan Dundes offered an expansive definition of who the folk were. He shifted from the meaning of peasants or some rural underclass to the concept of folk group, which he defined as any group of people whatsoever who shared at least one common factor. Folk groups proved to be a useful concept, one that in a way had been present since the beginning. However, Dundes' redefinition encouraged folklorists to find folklore in the small groups that all of us are a part of. Folklore could be found with fraternity brothers, midwives, doctors, lawyers, fishermen, quilters, cooks, rangers, cousins, banjo players, tattoo artists, drag queens, school teachers, undergrads. I think you get the point. From Dundes' perspective, everyone potentially has folklore. Moreover, each of us belong to multiple groups at any one time. So when we talk about Indiana folklore, it really depends on who we decide are the folk and what we mean by Indiana. If, as Dundes has argued, we all are the folk and have folklore, then we have to get a handle on the Indiana part, don't we? When we add the adjective Indiana to folklore, what do we mean? Is it only the people who are originally from here? When is the cutoff? Before 1814, other than a few French and English settlements, the land that would become Indiana was populated by a range of Native American groups, including Miami, Shawnee, Delaware, Potawatomi, and others. Are we talking about their traditions, which are rooted in place, at least before Indian removal? Or are we talking about the early settlers who made Indiana their home? That's what a lot of people tend to think. However, these people never really constituted a cohesive group. They were French and Vincennes, Germans and Jaspers, Swiss and Bern, and a range of other ethnic enclaves that have made their home in distinctive ways here in Indiana. How about the many African Americans who strive to escape the land south of the Ohio River to find freedom and establish free communities, like those who came to the community that's now known as Lisle Station in the 1830s? Then again, what are we going to do with the Serbian, Polish, and Mexican and other immigrant communities who came to our state in the late 19th and early 20th centuries? They maintain music, crafts, stories, food traditions from their home countries that have taken root here in Indiana and become central to community life, especially in the Calumet region of our state. How about the newer immigrant communities, like the large Salvadoran community down in rural Huntingburg, Indiana, who invite their community to join with them each year in their Latin Expo? Or perhaps the Burmese communities that are in Indianapolis and Fort Wayne, who came here as refugees, but have built their lives here for generations now. My feeling is that drawing the line at any one of these groups fails to understand the dynamic nature of communities and folklore. A lot of the interest in Indiana folklore in the early 20th century worked to establish notions of the white Anglo pioneer settler who tamed the land. The reality is, it's much, much more complicated than that. Throughout this class, we'll discuss a range of community groups, both from the past and today, and approach the idea of an Indiana folk as not a fixed group, but rather a big tent that includes a range of people who make their home in Indiana. Now that we have a little bit of history and have a handle, maybe, on the folk, in the next unit, I'll discuss notions of the lore, and how, given our new expanded definition of the folk, lore could no longer be viewed solely as something that survived like a rare family heirloom, but it is rather something more dynamic and emergent.